Good morning, everyone. This is Project Co-op, Computerized Officer Operations Placement, Horsa Crow High School Team 66. I'm Zhang. I was responsible for developing the concept and also doing research.
I'm Cody Johnston. I was in charge of the visualization aspect of this project.
I'm Lucas Ward. I'm a freshman, and I was responsible for doing research as well as contacting important people.
I'm Rio Sessions, a sophomore, and I was responsible for developing the model algorithm.
Today, we're going to be going over acknowledgements first. We have some people we'd like to thank who've helped us along the way. Next, we'll introduce our model. Then we'll get into our model proper, which includes an algorithm and visualization section. Then we'll talk about our results, how we verified our model and forecasting. Then we'll conclude with applications and limitations. So first, we have some people we'd like to thank. We'd like to thank the Socorro High School staff and faculty, Aza Azat, Melba Aguilar, Tori Finley, Lori Capps, Kurt Lair, Jesse Griffith, and Dana Edskorn for listening to us practice and providing constructive feedback.
We would like to give a special thank you to Jay Garcia for mentoring us and sponsoring us, for supporting us the whole way and always going the extra mile.
We would like to thank the Supercomputing Challenge organizers and volunteers for putting this whole event together. It's a time and effort to make this competition a blast.
We would like to thank the Albuquerque Police Department and the Real-Time Crime Center for replying to our emails in a timely period, giving us much needed information.
We'd like to thank Dr. Maximo for reading our interim report and providing insight on where we should take our project next.
We would like to thank Dr. Curry for reading our final report and providing feedback and very valuable pointers.
We'd like to thank Dr. Sela Dambrodsky for reading our final report and reaching out to provide feedback.
We would like to thank Dr. Sessions for reviewing and proofreading our final report and giving us advice as to how to improve it.
We'd like to thank Andrew Davis for reviewing our slideshow and giving helpful suggestions. So again, good morning, everyone. I'm Zhang, a sophomore, and I'll be introducing the concept of our model and some background. In the modern era, police departments are often stretched on resources, which results in high response times and rising crime rates. We hypothesize for our solution is that if officers are deployed more efficiently, response times and crime will decrease. We have two objectives for this project. One is to lower response times. By deploying officers closer to where a call is likely to happen, they can already be there. And to increase efficiency by optimizing hotspot policing and making the best use of a department's manpower. To achieve our objectives, we're using two strategies. One is called hotspot policing, which basically involves the targeting of resources and activities to places where crime is most concentrated. The next is predictive policing, which uses mathematics, analytics, and other techniques to identify potential criminal activity. Put it simply, Project Co-op is a computational model designed to optimize the deployment of a limited number of police officers through combining elements, predictive and hotspot policing. It's designed to serve as a stopgap for police departments to address issues of budget, manpower, and high crime rates, and not intended as a permanent solution. We chose Albuquerque as our location for a variety of reasons. Firstly, data about previous crimes was readily available to civilians. It was easy to contact the Albuquerque Police Department Chief of Police, and also crimemapping.com, which the APD uses, is easily accessible to civilians like us. Albuquerque also has a high property and violent crime rate, which is combined with limited resources. It's ranked 4th in the state for overall crime rate, and its resources and budget is stretched thin. Albuquerque also has a high police response time. They had a 12-minute priority 1 response time in 2017, which, according to the Albuquerque fiscal year 2020 accepted budget report, is acceptable. But it's important to note that in a priority 1 call, which is basically shots fired, every second counts. Now, the 48-minute average response time in 2018 is a problem, and one that APD is seeking to improve. If it takes 48 minutes average to respond to, say, a burglary, then the perpetrator is already going to be gone by then. Albuquerque also has a relatively low population density, which means that people are more spread out, which emphasizes the need for more time efficiency. It's also a serious issue that New Mexico needs to solve. New Mexico is our community. And we want to help develop solutions for our problems. On the right, you'll see that there's a graph and charts of basically crime in Albuquerque at a glance. There's two pie charts which list total violent crime and total property crime in Albuquerque in 2016. There's also a graph showing how crime has climbed in Albuquerque over the years. Now, getting to the budget part, Albuquerque's police department is limited by the amount of personnel it can hire. In fiscal year 2018, 18% of Albuquerque's budget was allocated to the police. 74% of that went to personnel, which includes wages, maintaining its current roster of officers, paying for their health, also keeping personnel quotas, and replacing unfilled positions due to turnover. Some 14% went to operations, which is essentially patrols, which left very little that could hire officers with. It's also important to note that most departments allocate 80 to 90% of their budget to personnel. Departments are also limited by the amount of officers that can be hired due to political pressures. They can lose trust due to perceived wasted taxpayer money on unnecessary resources, and also high police presence can be perceived as a sign of oppression. It's something that departments want to manage because it can cause a loss of trust in the department's leadership, which you don't want. The consequences of all this add up to a high rate of victimization within Albuquerque. There's a 1 in 74 chance of violent crime in Albuquerque, 1 in 17 for property crime, and 1 in 14 for being a victim of overall crime. And this is a problem that we believe Project Co-op can help alleviate. Do we have any questions so far? All right, great. So now Rio Sessions, a sophomore, and Cody Johnston, a sophomore, will be talking a little bit about our model.
So I'm Rio Sessions, and I'll be discussing our model. So our model is broken up into two parts: the algorithm, which is written in Python 3, and the visualization, which is written in PHP, JavaScript, and HTML5. So the algorithm is broken up into three parts. First, the user entry and data interpretation. Second, forecasting crime based on the user entry and data interpretation. And finally, the officer placement based on the forecast of crime. So the user will enter a number of variables in addition to files. They'll first enter the city in which the crime data happened in. This is important so that we can determine where a particular address is. For example, 1200 Main Street. There are a lot of 1200 Main Streets, and so it's important to have the city so that we know where particularly it happened. The user will also enter the officer count, which is the number of officers that will be placed. They will enter the default weight. Each crime type is assigned a weight based on its severity. If for whatever reason a crime is not defined a weight, though, it'll be defaulted to this. 50 is a high weight because there's a decent chance if we don't know what a crime was in Albuquerque, it was probably a violent crime. The grid size is the size of areas that crime will be grouped in and officers will be placed in. So the default is 1 meter, but this is too low because it results in officers being clumped together. And then they will enter the maximum number of officers per grid. So in each grid size, the maximum number of officers. This prevents an excessive number of officers from being placed in one area. So the default is 3, but this has to be between 1 and 10. So the user will also enter the path to a data file. This will contain where crime happened, when the crime happened, and what happened. So the user entered city is placed at the end of the address so that we can tell where it is, and we can use the Google Places API to convert it to latitude and longitude, which is really important in officer placement and also visualization. We use the date time module to change the date and time that we're given into the number of days. So for example, February 15th, 2020, 46 days had elapsed since the beginning of the year. And so we also include leap years in this. So the incident becomes a weight based on the user entered weight file. If a weight for a certain day is 0, if weight for a certain day is not existent or the address isn't there, then it's automatically set to 0. If weights for a certain day are added together in order to get kind of a weight per day. So the user will also enter a path to a weight file. This contains weight data for each incident. So the incident type and the weight will be included. The weights are determined by the severity of incidents and as well what an officer can do about it. So for example, a forgery has a really low weight because an officer can't do much about a forgery unless they stand over everyone's shoulder and watch them sign a check. But shots fired is a violent crime and is given a high weight because if an officer was nearby, every second counts. So the user will also enter a path to 2 output files. These output files will contain predicted crime and officer locations based on that predicted crime. These files can then be uploaded to our web map for visual display and verification. So here's a quick demonstration of our user entry system. So the user is presented with this GUI when they first run the program. So the city is Albuquerque, New. Hang on, I forgot about this part. So can you all see this screen?
Yes.
Okay. So upon running the code, the user is presented with this GUI. It has areas to enter all of the variables. The city is Albuquerque, New Mexico defaulted because that is where we're trying to model. The officer count in August of 2019, according to KOB4, the Albuquerque police force had 972 officers. So if they work in 4 shifts, that's 243 officers. The default weight is 50 because there's a decent chance that a crime was violent. The grid size was too small. 750 is a large enough grid size so that we can determine where officers should be placed, but they won't clump together. And then these are the paths to the data files and the output files. And so then this progress bar will appear, and this determines how far into the data interpretation that the program is. So now I'll discuss how we forecast crime. We use 2 algorithms in order to forecast crime, and we average them together. We use what we call a time-based weighted regression and an analysis of the recent trend. When averaged, the time-based weighted regression tended to be a little bit of an overestimate, and the analysis of the recent trend tended to be an underestimate of crime in an area. So when averaged together, they would create a more accurate point. And then we run and average these algorithms for each address in the data file to get a predicted crime for every place in the data file. So the time-based weighted average is the sum of the crime weight times the day that had elapsed since the first day over the sum of all of the days. So for example, if we had an original data file where from February 3rd to February 7th, where the weight is 50, 45, and so on and so forth on each day, first we adjust the time to determine how many days had elapsed since the first day in the data file, since the first day. So February 3rd, 1 day had elapsed. And so then we get the sum of all of those days, which is 15, and we put that on the denominator of our fraction of the total predicted point. Then we have the numerator. So on the first elapsed day, or February 3rd, that's 1, and we multiply the weight of that day times 50. Then when we do this and add them all together, we get the forecast weight for this particular address to be 38. And then the recent trend attempts to determine a recent pattern in the data. So this, first we run a linear regression of the 5 most recent points. If the slope of this previous point is within 5% of the calculated regression, then we run the regression again, including that previous point. As long as this previous point slope is within 5% of the calculated regression, we keep backing up. So here's an example of our forecast method. The 3 points on the right represent our forecast. The green triangle represents the recent trend. The red square represents our weighted, time-based weighted regression. And the magenta pentagon represents our forecasted point, the average of the two. The blue line represents the data, so it's been really in bumps recently. And finally, the green dashed line represents what the recent trend was calculated as. So recently, the crime had been spiking, so the recent trend caught that and spiked. So the officer placement, we determine the location of officers based on what we predicted the crime of an area to be. So in order to do that, we first fit the prediction data resolution to the resolution that the user defined. This is also the variable grid size, so the size of area that crime is grouped in to place officers. Then we determine the number of officers per each of these grid areas. So in order to group the data, we first use the user input of grid size. We convert from meters that it's entered in to latitude and longitude. Then we find the reciprocal of that and multiply it by the latitude or longitude. This will give us a number that's not latitude and longitude, but it will also give us a decimal behind that, and we remove that decimal. This groups similar numbers together. So if they were off by a very small amount, they were estimated to be the same place. And this will allow for grouping of crime data into these grids. So then in order to locate officers, we find the total crime weight of the city. So that's all of the crime weights added together. Then we find a weight per officer. So that's the total weight of the city divided by the number of officers the user defined. Then we iterate through all groups of crime data or grids in the city. So the number of officers that will go in each grid or group of crime data is the weight of that grid. So the sum of all of those combined points divided by the weight per officer. We then round this down so that we will have unplaced officers. These unplaced officers will go in areas where there are no officers. This will be ranked in order of high crime weights. Are there any questions thus far? All right. Now Cody Johnston will talk about our visualization process.
So our visualization process is divided into 3 steps: data reception, data interpretation, and data display. So the first part is data reception. Our data is received or uploaded as text files in a longitude, latitude, weight format. This is for the heat map. For the officers, it's similar. It's longitude, latitude, number of officers. The file is then scanned for formatting errors and to ensure it's a text file. It's then stored in our server. The data is then opened by our site and turned into a usable format. This is called tokenization. The program then separates the longitude and latitudes and saves them to an array. It also averages the position. It also averages all the points on the map to position the map at a mean location. The site writes the data to a web file using the JavaScript and the Google Maps API. The site then redirects to this web file. The web file displays the crime and suggested police placements as well as the numbers. Here's a demonstration of our data display. So here's our site. Our heat map is here. The heat map loads in, and this is the center of all the data points that we received. And we can see here the heat map, the more red an area is, the more forecasted, the more crime we predict to happen there. And the blue pointers are officer placement. As you can see, as we zoom in, they're in grids. This one right here doesn't have a number. That's 1 officer. This one has 2. We suggest 2 officers. This one has 3, and so on. Is there any questions so far? Next is Lucas Ward. He'll be discussing our results and our model verification.
Our model had varying results. We created a web interface that is user-friendly and easy to use, and our program stationed police officers according to where previous crimes took place and what crimes took place. Although our crime predictions are imperfect, and we'll get to that later. So to verify our model, we used data from 3 sources. We used crimemapping.com, which is a web tool used to track and map crime. And we also spoke to the Albuquerque Police Department, who also verified our sources, as well as the Real-Time Crime Center, which is an organization dedicated to assisting police officers with situational awareness. On the left is crime data with incidents from the 5th and the 6th of April. Okay. On the right is a heat map of the forecast crime data based on data from the 4th of March to the 4th of April. This is what it looks like when we overlay the crime data from the 5th and 6th onto our heat map. And as you can see, they overlap relatively well, supporting the fact that our algorithm can predict crime relatively well. So the crime data on this map is February the 12th, and the heat map forecast is data from January the 11th to February the 11th. And as you can see, for the most part, they overlap pretty well, except for a discrepancy on the far left where little to no crime was predicted. So to conclude with our forecast verification, we found that much of the crime that happened was in an area of predicted high crime, although some of our predictions of high or low crime rates were in fact false. Now to conclude. We found that crime hotspots can be easily mapped and forecast, and that crime hotspots are easy to map and simple to understand. We also found that simple algorithms such as ours are able to, with a certain degree of success, reliably predict crime hotspots based on data. Found that police officers can, to a certain extent, be deployed based on data and crime forecasts. The Project Co-op forecasting model is, to a certain extent, accurate and precise. And we conclude that police officers can be efficiently utilized in order to lower crime in hotspot areas. We found that predicting and optimizing hotspot policing is not an end-all solution to crime. Project Co-op needs to be used correctly in order to be effective, and Project Co-op, if interpreted incorrectly, can be the cause of unfair targeting of certain communities and individuals.
All right,
How can our model be applied to the real world? Okay, yeah. Sorry guys, my internet is cutting out.
Okay,
so,
just checking.
Yeah, so I'm sorry about that. Excuse me. So how can a model be applied to the real world? It forecasts crime rates based on previous crime rates and optimizes hotspot policing, which is already an effective tool for lowering crime rate. It also allows police forces to better station police and allows them to stop more crime with less financial resources. And lastly, it gives police valuable information regarding the possible location of crimes, increasing situational awareness and saving lives. So our model is very useful, but it has its limits. It doesn't account for underserved areas, which can lead to discrimination. It also doesn't account for geographical obstructions, such as bodies of water, buildings. It also doesn't predict crime 100% accurately, which can lead to wasted police resources. It also requires accurate data from the past in order to function correctly, which can be hard to acquire. So our model is imperfect and it could lead to many unforeseen consequences. It could lead to the discrimination against those living in poverty and the targeting of certain underserved neighborhoods. It could also lead to inaccurate predictions, which would waste police resources. These are all the references and figures we used. Are there any final questions?
All right, thank you very much, guys. Judges, floor is open for questions.
I had one question here. At the beginning, you talked about response times for priority events and the overall response time. Do you think you could come up with, after you get your recommended placement of officers, do you think you could produce a response time that would correspond with that placement of officers?
So we currently don't have anything of the sort in the model, but it could be done so that you could determine based on streets and proximity, you could determine approximately how long it would take.
Would that give you a better measure of whether a placement of officers was good or bad?
It would give you a relative measure of whether or not it was good or bad for that particular day. But it would have to be, and if you went over it enough, it could determine whether or not the model was effective at placing officers based on potential response times, yes.
Okay.
So this is Dave Janicki. I was interested in your mission. We're getting a little bit of feedback here, sorry. Interested in your discussion in the paper about the broken window theory, and wondered if you'd thought a little bit about adding something like that into your model where, you know, police response isn't just to crime, but also to sort of attractors or even removal of attractors. In part, I'm intrigued about sort of flipping your model, and instead of just focusing on response, but looking at training issues for, say, management of the police department or management of other issues, integration with tow trucks, those sorts of things. Have you thought about other ways to use your model? And by the way, very good struggling through this this distributed teamwork here.
So I think I got most of that question. It cut out a little bit towards the end. So you're asking, could we use our model to try to but to try to address factors or influencers of crime based on the broken window effect?
Yeah, exactly.
Okay. So by having police in area, the broken window effect is just simply stated, if a window is broken in an area, if it gets fixed, the crime rate will stay the same. If it stays broken, the crime rate will will increase. So the idea of having police officers there and present would be to try, okay, so at the moment, we haven't yet addressed the influencers, but yeah, so but by addressing responses, then that allows for the window to get fixed without the crime rate dramatically increasing, and that will hopefully decrease the rate in that area.
One issue about fixing broken windows, if I may, is that it could be on private property, which the police department cannot address directly. But I do believe that given perhaps another year of development, our model could be used to station police officers, also based on influencers. So for example, the broken window theory, if there was a community that had a broken window, then if an officer was there, logically, it would be rational to conclude that perhaps a police presence would keep the crime from rising.
This is Stephen Guerin. I had a question about the officer locations. Did you bring up about, is the historical location of officers available from the real-time crime lab or the APD? Did you discuss that?
We didn't receive any data on the historical
we
placement of
didn't receive
officers.
Yeah, we didn't receive any of that information.
So one of the potentials for next year would be in the emergency responder world, that's called like AVL, or automatic vehicle location. Sometimes it's the officers or their vehicles. And perhaps if there was a simulation of if you had vehicle location and maybe you're simulating crime and estimating the effect of officers with crime, maybe with a simulation to show APD to actually get their location data, in the future. So more and more of these departments do have location of officers in historical files. So that would be a really nice addition in the future, and also, and just looking at the impact of officer location on actual crime. Does that make sense?
Yes.
Yes, sir.
Yes, that does.
Yes, it does.
All right, we're out of time. Team 66, thank you very much.
Thank you for
Yeah,
listening
thank
to our
you.
presentation.
Very nice.
Thank you for taking time to listen to us.
Yeah, thank you guys for taking the time to come here and watch us present.
Yeah, thank you guys for volunteering.
Enjoy your day, guys.
You too.
You too. Have a good day.
You too.
Yep, have a good day, everyone.